now. Hello again, and welcome to Whither the Looniversity, the podcast of the Peerless Review. I'm Adam Ellwanger, and I'm excited about my guest today. He's Professor Emeritus at UCLA, where he was a researcher in anthropology, achieved full professor there. He studies social behavior in non-human primates and humans. He's a winner of very many research grants, including some from the National Science Foundation. He's published a slew of scholarly publications over his 30 plus years in academia. And most recently, he made national news when he resigned his professorship, a decision that he explains in his recent blog post entitled "Why I'm Leaving the University." We'll talk about that decision at length, but first I wanted to welcome our guest, Professor Joseph Manson. Joe, thanks for talking with us.
Thanks, Adam. Thanks for hosting this podcast and giving me an opportunity to talk about the sorry state of higher education in this country.
I'm excited to hear about it, but before we get to that, I wanted you to tell us what about anthropology seduced you in the beginning? How did you become attracted to this field of study? And tell us a little bit about your training in that field.
I've been interested in what makes people tick and what makes societies tick since I was a teenager. And as an undergraduate at UC Santa Barbara and UC Berkeley, I discovered anthropology, and what enthralled me about it was the promise of the broadest possible study of the human condition, everything from our primate ancestors of tens of millions of years ago to religion and ritual. So it encompasses concerns that are associated with psychology and economics and sociology and biology, and brings all those to bear on understanding what it means to be human. So that's what got me into it. And my initial focus when I started graduate school was what was at that time called human sociobiology. So studying human behavior from the standpoint of evolutionary or adaptationist theory, and in an ethnographic context. So my first graduate advisor when I started grad school in 1982 was Napoleon Chagnon at Northwestern University. But within a few years, I had switched to primate behavior, and that's what occupied my career until the mid-aughts. So I studied mating patterns and mate choice in rhesus monkeys. So my PhD dissertation is about that. And then, along with Susan Perry, did a study of lots of topics in social behavior in wild white-faced capuchin monkeys in Costa Rica. That project's still going on, although I'm not part of it anymore. And then, so in the mid-aughts, I, for various reasons that aren't really very interesting, decided to transition back to studying humans, but not from an ethnographic point of view, but from a more psychological point of view. So most of the research I've done the past 15 years would fit much more comfortably in a psychology department than an anthropology department. I was interested in small group dynamics, and then more recently in personality variation. But all of the research is motivated by an evolutionary perspective. So that's the one unifying theme in all of my work.
So this is a sort of a question that I have for you of my own interest. Why does an anthropologist research primates? Is it only because we could see in them kind of a proto-human sociology or something to that effect, that we could learn something about the earliest forms of our civilization by looking at how they interact with one another? Is this where the evolutionary idea comes in?
Basically, yes. So behavioral primatology did not become part of anthropology until around the 1950s. Before that, what was then called physical anthropology and what we now call biological anthropology It was about the human fossil record and about modern human genetic variation. And yes, the reason why primatology got folded into biological anthropology was the idea that we can better interpret the human fossil record, especially those things which just don't fossilize, like behavior, by comparison with the behavior of living non-human primates.
This is very interesting. And I'm going to ask you some more about the state of anthropology generally. But first, we should get to the big news. You recently announced on your blog that you were resigning your post as full professor. You've written a little bit about this story, but the story is very much in line with some of the concerns of this program vis-a-vis the sort of woke revolution that's unfolding in the academy. And anytime I see someone like you resign, someone who's a full professor at a Research One university, who's been in good standing in his field for a number of decades, it turns my head, because you are leaving what by all accounts would be considered a very comfortable job, at least if we look at the formal tasks of this work. And so some of our viewers may have already read your blog post, but I wanted to hear you tell it in your own way, maybe from the beginning of when you got wind of sort of the winds of revolutionary change sweeping through the university, up until the point at which you say you just didn't see kind of a reason to stay around anymore. And I might jump in here and there to ask you to elaborate on some of the points that you didn't elaborate on in the blog post. So will you tell us about it?
The short version. Alexander Solzhenitsyn in 1974 published an essay called "Live Not by Lies," and recently Rod Dreher borrowed that title for a book. And the argument is that totalitarian systems both generate and are dependent on a social order in which people in their public personas are constantly telling lies that support the system, and constantly and pretending to believe lies told by others. Now, of course, the United States is not a totalitarian society, or if it were, we wouldn't be having this conversation. But there are certainly some totalitarian-ish qualities of life in many institutions, not just academic institutions today. There's pressure under threat of being fired or boycotted or ostracized to dissemble, to pretend not to be troubled by things that are very troubling, to pretend to believe things we don't really believe. So I gradually realized that I had three choices. I could keep quiet, that is, live by lies about what I was seeing. I could speak out, and I concluded that would have changed nothing for the better. All it would have done is made my professional life miserable. Or I could leave, and because I'm financially able to, that's what I decided to do. That's the short. An even shorter version is a paraphrase of something that Jonathan Haidt posted recently, which is, the woke are taking all the fun out of academic life.
Yeah, that's I think that's indubitable. So let's say if you rewound in the years, when did this journey to this point begin? I mean, was it a year or two ago? Was it after the 2020 riots and COVID, or did it begin much earlier than that?
It began around 2015 or 2016, around the same time that there was, I mean, nationwide, there was the blow up at University of Missouri. There was the incident at Yale with the Halloween costumes, and so shortly after that, there began to be those same sort of processes in my department. The department had been gradually, one hire at a time, had been come under the domination of a clique of the far left postmodernists. They were not a majority of the department, but they were by far the most influential faction. Some of the things that first began to disturb me are things I can't talk about because they happened at in confidential deliberations. The first event that I can talk about that started me thinking along the lines that I didn't want to be there anymore was when my colleague Jeff Branningham, who creates predictive models of crime, so it's possible by mapping where and when crimes are happening in a city, because they have a kind of autocorrelative pattern that you can, by means of machine learning, an algorithm can then predict where crime is likely to happen at a high frequency in the near future. And the purpose of the software is to help police to allocate limited resources, right, to where to send patrols. In 2018, the graduate student organization in my department passed a resolution condemning Jeff and calling for an investigation of his work by the vice chancellor for research. And this resolution, there's not a shred of scholarly, or there's not a shred of substantive content of any kind in it. It reads like a kind of a medieval or early modern proclamation of anathema. A heresy, yes. They accuse him of being complicit in criminalizing blackness and so on and so forth. I mean, it might as well be saying that he's been consorting with Satan, and so based on this, then he was ostracized. People no longer spoke to him. Some of the faculty were sympathetic to these grad students, forced him to, and I know this sounds petty and meaningless, but he wasn't allowed to use one of the course numbers, which is for a course that he teaches on the ecology of crime. So he had been using a course number which placed it among the sociocultural anthropology courses, and he was forced to start using a different kind of number. I guess they didn't want,
That doesn't seem petty, though, because as you know, what that is a way for his colleagues to signify you are not welcome here.
Exactly.
And I wonder, this graduate student organization, they presumably had no real standing to call for any kind of investigation at all. There's probably no formal channel for such a thing to begin with, is there?
No, there isn't. And to the credit of the administration, there was no investigation.
Very Maoist.
Yeah, it was. Yes.
Yeah.
They probably would have wanted to do is parade him around campus in a dunce cap.
This is one of the things that interests me reading about the software that you were talking about, that your colleague came up with, is it's characteristic of the woke mind, right? That they never said that your colleague was actually trying to target anybody of some racial minority. So they completely allied the fact that in fact there is a minority skew in terms of where crime happens and what crimes are committed. That has nothing to do with your colleague at all. Your colleague's software, I assume, is race blind. It's just looking at where the crime happens, and they say that's racist. Is that right?
Yes. Well, there's, I think in one version of the software, it's what gets coded is where the crime, what kind of crime it was, where it happened, when it happened. And I think in one version of it, it also tags whether or not the crime was gang related. And I think that was one of the points of controversy, that saying something was gang related is in and of itself a kind of a racial bias.
I see. All right, so continue. So, and one of the things that interested me in reading your blog posts is you said that as sort of the departmental pressure accumulated against your colleague, you actually offered to stand up to this pressure. And if I remember right, your colleague said, well, thanks, but no thanks, just stay out of it.
Yes, and I don't want to speculate on what his strategy was in facing this, but it certainly seemed like rather than a public confrontation, that he wanted to disassociate himself from the department. They weren't threatening to fire him, so he still had his teaching. He still had his salary, and he still did some of his research. That's my interpretation of what was going on.
Yeah, I think that's a difficult decision that some heretical researchers have to make. Is can you hold on to the position even while you're effectively ostracized from any aspect of department life? And I think it makes sense that different people would weigh the hardship of that differently.
Yeah.
So you're observing this, and what's the breaking point then for you? Just the aftermath, or does 2020 come along and take it to a whole new level, or what?
So, well, part of it was that the public torment of Jeff Branningham was not finished with yet, and in March 2020, a flyer appeared in the halls of the department, and I posted that with the blog that called for a meeting to let me see here if I can. It's best to quote the thing directly. Academic complicity to academic rebellion. Join with the fight with your thought and action, as many other UCLA faculty and students are rebelling and speaking out against academic complicity and taking action! ! And this campaign involved not just grad students but faculty in our department. So the fact that this was happening and the way it was being treated in the department, which no one publicly talked about Jeff Branningham, and the people who had taken the lead in ostracizing him were central figures in the department. And the things that were said in faculty meetings were so discordant with what was actually going on. About, we're a family here. We're here for each other. It got to be really difficult to listen to this sort of thing. And in private conversation, some of my colleagues would admit that, yes, Jeff's been treated abominably. But in public, it was the people who had banished him who prevailed. There were other things, though.
Those types are scary, though. Like, I mean, I think that's fairly common that there's a certain type of person who can see the craziness of academic politics, but who are not a type of confrontational person who could stand up to the dressing down that they would receive from the most radical colleagues if they voiced their opposition.
Yes, there's people place a high value on social cohesion and harmony, and it can be very difficult to throw that away. Another one of the last straws was, and this is going to sound vague. That's unavoidable. But I was on a committee, and the committee was charged with allocating scarce resources, scarce opportunities. And in these kinds of deliberations, it is a major consideration is to what extent the people who are contending for these resources will advance diversity, right? And here the question came up as to whether a person who claimed to be of non-binary gender should be counted as advancing or contributing to diversity, and therefore being receiving favorable treatment in the allocation of scarce resources. Now, I'm opposed to racial preferences, but I can see that there's a case to be made for them. Whereas the idea that people of non-binary gender should count as advancing diversity and therefore receive preferential treatment, that's something else. It's something else altogether. For one thing, the category of being of non-binary gender was 10 years ago, it didn't exist, or it didn't exist outside the minds of a small number of academics. So it can't be said that these people have been historically marginalized or excluded, because the social category has no history. And another thing is that belonging to a racial category is the criteria for it. Well, they're not objective, but they are publicly verifiable. And the reason we know that is because there have been cases, mostly involving academics, in which white people were exposed as having falsely claimed to be Black or Native American, and then were disgraced.
I heard about a case like that in Massachusetts politics.
Yes, and there was yes, certainly that. Although these academics faced, even harsher penalties for this. There was someone called Jessica Krug at George Washington University. And there have been others too. But if it's possible for someone to falsely claim to belong to a racial category, then that must mean that there are publicly verifiable criteria for membership. Whereas, what would it even mean for someone to falsely claim to be of non-binary gender? It can't mean anything at all, because the only basis for being of non-binary gender is the claim itself.
Yeah.
So here you have this category which was just invented, and membership in it is solely by self-assignment. And people of this category are supposed to get preferential treatment. And to me, there's no case to be made for this at all. It's both absurd and unfair. But on this committee, I realized that if I'd expressed any doubts about this, then I would have been tagged as a bigot, and also, possibly even worse than that, I would have been tagged as someone who's gumming up the institutional machinery, who's wasting people's time in a culture war argument when this committee has an agenda it has to get through. So I didn't say anything. I'm not proud of this, but it occurred to me that this sort of thing is just going to happen again and again and again from now on. That I'm going to face this decision of keep quiet and live by lies, or speak up, and which wouldn't change anyone's mind. It would only lead to my own marginalization.
So you've put your finger on a difficult question that I have. You said that you were starting graduate school in the 1980s, early 1980s, at which point I was 3 or 4 years old. And so now you are probably approaching what would be a realistic retirement age anyway. I'm 44, and I have mixed feelings when I hear about cases like yours. Partly, when I heard about your case, I thought, well, good for Joe, good for him. That's a strong move. But then another part of me is like, if everybody does what you did, then we hand over whatever's left of I guess the institution to the worst elements in the institution. If you were my age today, right, and let's say that the money wasn't a concern, let's say you had the money to be able to retire, except at my age, early 40s, would you still do it, or would that be a different scenario? I mean, what advice would you give to somebody who might be 20 years younger than you about how to inhabit the university for the next 20 or 30 years from now, or to depart it altogether?
I'm very reluctant to give advice of that kind. I study personality variation, but I think you don't need to study it as a person to understand how different people are from each other, and what's best for one person is not necessarily best for another. I didn't see myself as a person who could be a successful, active, outspoken dissident. But some people are, and they would do more good both to themselves and to institutions by staying in their jobs. So I'm sorry, that probably sounds like I'm
no, it's
ducking.
Understandable. If I was in your position, I might not want to give a definitive answer either, because you don't want to influence the decision making of other people for such an important decision that everybody needs to make on their own terms. And yet, I'm sorry that you will not be teaching next semester. I wonder if we can shift to a discussion of the field of anthropology in general. I had a chance to talk to Peter Wood from the National Association of Scholars a few weeks back. When he was a professor, he was an anthropologist, and he said that this field is all but lost now. I also read on Minding the Campus this week that I think Professor Salzman, I think up at McGill, says something very similar, that anthropology is in big trouble. I think that for many people, at least in higher ed, the vision that we have of anthropology is not the vision that we have of English departments or psychology departments or sociology departments. And yet it seems, when I look at high profile anthropologists talking about the state of anthropology, it seems that the sort of woke infantata has reached anthropology now. What do you have to say about the state of the discipline?
Okay, so first, some background that some of your listeners might need. So anthropology consists of 4 subfields. There's sociocultural anthropology, which studies cultural variation and also commonalities. There's archaeology, which also studies cultural variation, but cultural variation in the past, as we can learn about that from basically the garbage and ruins that people have left behind. Linguistic anthropology, and that's just because language is both uniquely human and is so central to the human condition that it merits its own subfield. And biological anthropology, which studies humans as animals. And so this includes the human fossil record and human genetic variation and human adaptations to extreme environments like high altitude and non-human primate behavior. So for a few decades, there's been a trend for sociocultural anthropologists to become less and less scientists, and even less and less disinterested scholars, and more political activists. So Peter Wood wrote an article in 2016. The title of it was How Anthropology Was Corrupted and Killed. And one of the sentences in that article is, anthropology departments today typically include a few people who know about DNA and evolution, as a biological anthropologist, and a whole lot of other people committed to social justice by celebrating one or another kind of victimhood. Well, since 2016, it's gotten a lot worse, in that today, even many biological anthropologists are on board the so-called social justice bandwagon. And here's just a couple of examples. Well, first, some background about what biologists mean by the male-female phenomenon. So in organisms that reproduce by means of gametes, almost the vast majority of multicellular organisms, there are exactly 2 size classes of gametes. The smaller ones we call sperm, and the larger ones we call eggs. That's the definition of the male-female phenomenon to a biologist.
This is sex. This is, what's the concept of biological sex is premised on, right?
Yes, this is the concept of biological sex at the gamete level. Now, at the individual level, there are some species like earthworms in which individuals are hermaphrodites. They produce both eggs and sperm. And then there's some like clownfish in which individuals at any one time will produce only one type of gamete, but under certain circumstances they can switch.
This doesn't seem to happen in the human population.
In all mammals, there are no functional hermaphrodites in any mammal. So mammals are the mammalian body is designed by natural selection to reproduce either exclusively as a female or exclusively as a male. Okay. Now, just earlier this year, a prominent biological anthropologist named Agustin Fuentes, who's at Princeton, and who, by the way, was one of the signatories of this set of demands from a few hundred Princeton faculty to their administration, calling for, among other things, a university committee that will monitor professors' research and punish professors for "quote unquote" racist research. This was the petition that Joshua Katz wrote an argument against, and that was the beginning of his ordeal. So Fuentes he's an avowed enemy of academic freedom. This article, it's not in the peer-reviewed journal. It's in some kind of popularized science online magazine. Yeah, the title of it is let's see. The title. I want to get the title right here. Biological science rejects the sex binary, and that's good for humanity. In this article, the words gamete or ovum or sperm, they do not occur at all. So all the facts that he cites in the article, they're completely irrelevant to the question that the article supposedly addresses.
So what you're saying is all the biological elements of sex don't come into play in this discussion of that we're doing away with biological sex.
So it's what he cites are certain correlates, some correlates which are restricted to certain taxa, certain groupings of organisms. So he says, well, there's some species in which males do more of the care of young offspring than females do. And there's some species in which females are more aggressive and pugnacious than males are. So so it's pseudoscience, and yet this is someone who's very prominent in the field. The next example, and this was in a peer-reviewed journal, the International Journal of Primatology. It's an article calling for the renaming of primate species that were named for people who were imperialists or participated in imperialism.
I see, oppressors.
Oppressors, exactly. So we need to rename primate species that have been named after oppressors. And one of the people who is condemned in this way is Diane Fossey, the researcher who started studying mountain gorillas. And there's now a species of tarsier that's named after Diane Fossey. And apparently Fossey had racist attitudes and treated Rwandan people badly. Although, as I understand it, it was that she treated poachers badly. It wasn't that she was biased against all Rwandans, but she was very incensed by poaching. So, one of the authors of this article is David Watts, who got his start, did his dissertation research, and built his early reputation on studying the mountain gorillas at Diane Fossey's study site. And I can tell you from personal experience that setting up a study site, study primates in the wild, involves a lot of unglamorous drudgery, habituating the animals to human presence so that they don't run away. They just go about what looks like their normal activities, learning to recognize individuals, things like cutting trails. So this is a huge amount of work, and then other people can benefit from it. So David Watts owes a debt of gratitude to Diane Fossey, and yet here he is in print saying that she should be stripped of her honors. And of course, our predecessors, no matter what our field, our predecessors were flawed human beings, and we're flawed human beings too. And if we're going to make it a prerequisite for being honored that someone be morally pure, well, then we're not going to be able to honor anyone.
So let me ask you a little bit about anthropology. You mentioned this as a subfield, and recently I've read that there's a push from certain woke quarters to no longer identify human remains as being male or female because we can't possibly know how those people identified when they are living. This sounds to me like an example of the sort of social activists wing of the discipline that you talk about. And I can understand how this would work in an English department, right? Like in an English department, here's how it would work. You assign your students the novel called The Awakening by Kate Chopin, right? And then you say, what'd you think about the story? And they say, oh, that woman in that beach house had it so awful. She was so put upon. And then you say, yes. And that's still the way it is for women. I don't quite understand like how this would work in anthropology. What do? Do you go back and look at these sort of ancient cultures or societies and say and see there was oppression there too? Like how does that, what's the move? I don't understand. How does anthropological research become leveraged for activist purposes? Can you explain that a little bit?
I think with regard to interpreting or reconstructing what was going on in ancient societies, it's I don't know if it can be. I don't think it can be leveraged directly for activist purposes. This is an example of just a kind of, well, playing with words that postmodernists like to do. I think that with regard to studying contemporary societies, there seems to me a growing trend to condemning any interpretation of the cultures of non-white people by white people, any interpretation that's coming from outside of the culture itself. So there's a move that to press anthropologists into service either as basically just stenographers, so just reporting what the people themselves say, not interpreting anything, or becoming full-time activists. So yes, the white ethnographer could be justified in doing field work among non-white people if he or she is mostly involved in lobbying on their behalf against governments or against oil companies or what have you. That's okay, but to do what ethnographers have traditionally done, which is to interpret people's way of life, that's increasingly frowned upon.
Right. This is I'm sure you're probably familiar with Mary Louise Pratt, an English professor who wrote a little bit about ethnography, and at least in my field is kind of the person who's remembered for teaching us all that ethnography is bad and that autoethnography is the only morally acceptable way to approach any understanding of any culture that's not your own. You also talked a little bit about just sort of contemporary identity categories. And one thing that I noticed in some of your writing is sort of you allude in various places to the soft anti-Semitism that obtains on campus. How does that fit into this basically the cult of victimhood? It always seems to be strange that for people who are so attuned to cultural or identitarian grievance that they completely forget about the history of Jewish people in the 20th century and what exactly was prosecuted against them. What's your take on this?
Well, there's a really good essay by James Lindsay. I think the title of it is Critical Race Theory Has a Jewish Problem. And it's a long and deep essay. There's, for one thing, if you think about oppression simplistically in terms of skin color, okay, the lighter skinned people oppressing the darker skinned people, then that makes it very difficult to fit in the history of the persecution of the Jews because they weren't distinguished from European Christians by skin color. That's one thing. Another thing is that if you look at the historical rationales for Jew hatred in Europe. Often Jews were portrayed as oppressors themselves, okay, as as the
money lenders and such.
Right, exactly, money lenders and lackeys of the ruling class, and also that well, okay. Those are the two pieces of it that I'm confident that I can convey accurately. But there's it's Jews are hard to for woke ideology, as fixated as it is on notions of oppression. It's very difficult for it to fit Jews in as being oppressed. And this gets taken to absurd lengths sometimes. And then, of course, in recent times, so Jew hatred is very chameleon-like, and it has changed over the centuries to fit with to match the background, the prevailing worldview. And so there was Christian Jew hatred. So the answer to the question, what's wrong with those Jews, is, well, they don't accept Christ. There was a brand of Enlightenment Jew hatred, people like Voltaire saying, well, what's wrong with the Jews? It's exactly the opposite. So they gave the world Christianity, and now they're among the most backward people in Europe, superstitious and clinging to medieval ways. And then there was socialist Jew hatred. Well, what's wrong with the Jews is that their God is actually money. That's what Marx said. There was nationalist Jew hatred. What's wrong with the Jews is that they're not really true sons and daughters of the soil, which then morphed into racialized Jew hatred. But the fashionable kind today, fitting with the fashionable ideologies, is anti-nationalist or post-nationalist Jew hatred. So what's wrong with the Jews is that they insist on having a nation, an ethno-state, the worst possible kind of state, when enlightened opinion says that we must. If
there's going to be a state, then it better be a diverse one.
Exactly, and that nationalism leads to war and genocide, and the nation state is it's a very suspect construct all around.
Yeah, that's it's kind of shocking. Sometimes I think about, for as minoritarian as higher ed is in its orientation, it's like the two minorities that arguably you would least want to inhabit openly on a college campus are devout Jew or evangelical Christian. And yet those two categories have very little standing in the moral hierarchy of the woke dispensation.
Right. So so there's little or no effort to empirically assess oppressed versus oppressor status. It's very much a kind of deductive and then fixed kind of fixed and unchallengeable structure as to
intuition.
Yes.
Yep. So how do you think we got here? I mean, you've been in and around universities for, like you said, since the early 80s. I mean, was the element that's empowered now, the revolutionary element within higher ed, were they always there, sort of waiting for their moment? Or if it really has gotten more acute over the last decade, if they've been more overt in honestly stating their aspirations for the culture of the university, how did we get here? What happened?
Oh, I think like any social phenomenon, or for that matter, even trying to explain the behavior of one individual in one situation, there's always a multi-causal explanation. So there are lots of things going on. There's the gradual the long march through the institutions as more and more positions of power are occupied by people holding this ideology. There's what Peter Turchin calls elite overproduction. And so we hand out more credentials that are supposed to be tickets into the elite than there are positions in the elite. That leads to ferocious competition. And woke ideology provides an excellent arena for the competition. So if you can discover some hitherto unrecognized form of oppression, which can be, just a form of the way people use language or some other kind of symbolic behavior, then you can distinguish yourself from your competitors. And if you can brand your competitors as oppressors, that's even better.
And if you're an employer or seeking graduate students and you've got a lot of qualified candidates, now you've got some criteria that could serve as a tiebreaker.
Exactly. There's the rise of victimhood culture. Bradley Campbell and Jason Manning have written a book about this, that there was at one point in Western history, there was a culture of honor, then there was culture of dignity. Now what's replaced that is the culture of victimhood, which resembles the culture of honor in that people are supposed to become upset, take umbrage at being insulted. But unlike the culture of honor, you're not supposed to take revenge on your own behalf. You're supposed to run to the authorities or the court of public opinion and portray yourself as a victim. And then there's also, and this is closely related to this, is what Lukianoff and Haidt call the coddling of the American mind, the rise of safetyism rooted in child-rearing practices in which children are taught that they deserve to be absolutely safe, including from emotional upset. I think that has, so Lukianoff and Haidt, the original article where they made this argument was in 2015. It has gone into overdrive during the pandemic. As a result, I would say not as a result of the pandemic, but as a result of the predominant public health response of the pandemic in this country. I had this experience this last winter quarter, and I'd already decided to retire. So at this point, I didn't care anymore about the teaching evaluations. Now how much time do we have left?
Well, we could talk for 10 more minutes, I think.
Okay, I'll try to make this story short then. The university said, we're going back to in-person instruction. We'd been on purely remote instruction for over a year, and they said, okay, at the end of January, when the Omicron wave had somewhat subsided, they said, we're going back to in-person instruction. So I said, okay, we're going back. And all my lectures are recorded, so students they didn't actually have to come to class to hear the lectures. But I did insist on having in-person exams for various reasons. It's impossible to have proper exams remotely. I had discovered that. And 20% of the students and all 6 of my teaching assistants wrote me this petition demanding that I have the exam be an online exam, that it was just too dangerous to have 300 people in the same room for an hour. And remember, almost all these people are under 30 and in good health. Okay, they're at much lower risk of severe illness from COVID than I am. I wrote a message to the entire roster and explained, why I was doing this, and I took a very diplomatic tack and said, well, the same experts who told us at the beginning of the pandemic that we have to isolate ourselves, now they're saying it's safe to congregate again. But the numerical ratings I got on the evals were just down in the sub-basement. People wrote that it was terrible how I'd endangered them like this by forcing them to sit in a room with 300 people for an hour.
The most shocking part of that story to me is that all of your teaching assistants were willing to do this, which I think says a lot.
Yes.
When I was a graduate student, boy, if you come at your supervising faculty like that, you better have a legit grievance, not some complaint about sitting in a room for an hour.
That's where we're at. And actually 5 out of the 6 were not even qualified to TA the course. They had never even taken an introductory level course in the material. They were learning it a week ahead of the students.
Well, what's to learn, Joe? So is it salvageable? I mean, I think that your answer, I think, and I might be wrong, so if I am, correct me. I think that your answer is no, the institution's gone.
The reason that I'm okay, well, first, there are some things that political action and judicial action to bring, especially state universities, to bring them to their senses is worth doing. At least that way it's possible to stop unconstitutional violations of the right to free speech and the right to due process. So those things I'm in favor of, and also ways of sort of restricting the flow of money so that universities will be under some pressure to employ fewer bureaucrats, woke enforcing bureaucrats. Although I'm a little bit skeptical about that. I wonder if with less funding they would just abolish the classics department and some of the foreign language departments and keep all the bureaucrats. And also it's important to for reform in K-12 education, because as more and more students start university having been completely indoctrinated into wokeness in high school, it's going to become more and more difficult to improve things or keep things from getting worse at the college level. But the reason that I'm mostly enthusiastic about alternative institutions is this way. Well, the sort of top-down political and judicial action, it can't change the culture, and the culture is which things like safetyism and victimhood culture, which have given rise to this. Whereas alternative institutions then can be a kind of a sanctuary for 18-year-olds and their parents who don't buy into the prevailing culture. They don't want to. They're not coddled. They don't want to portray themselves as victims. They want a serious education, and over time, I don't like to think about higher education as a commodity. I don't think it should be, but unavoidably there are, market dynamics at work. And so if these alternative institutions like University of Austin can draw more and more of the best of the 18-year-olds and more of the money from donors, then this might put pressure on at least some of the established higher education institutions to they'll change their ways just to be able to compete. So a kind of selection process will take place. So I don't envision the demise of the great universities, but I think that some of them will in the most optimistic scenario, some of them will survive by changing in the face of competition from alternative institutions.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of will to set different kinds of those institutions up. I'm not sure that there are the patronage networks just yet among the donor class to make that happen. And
it's very difficult. People are so attached to their alma maters. So I received a few emails from alumni after my blog post saying, "Oh yeah, the university, it's not what it was when I was there." And I write back to them and I say, "Okay, well now it's up to you to stop donating and write to the chancellor and say I'm not donating more, and here's why. And instead, I'm sending my money to, to FIRE or to one of these alternative institutions."
Absolutely. If there are any alumni listening to this conversation, you need to know that the number one, pressure that you could put on an academic institution, especially a public one, is to withhold any donations of that sort and make sure they know why they're being withheld.
Yeah.
So, Joe, you're free now, in a sense. I hope that you will remain a vocal critic of the powers that now be in higher ed, especially since in some sense you are ungagged. You've said that you plan to continue your research, And I'm quite happy about that. But I also hope that you will continue to write about your experience in the university, different ways that we could reform what exists or create what doesn't, and also to help us remember the old university before the change. I want to thank you for being here today.
Well, thanks for having me. And this has been a great discussion, and I hope people get something out of it.
I'm sure they will. Thanks a lot.